Yeah, we can start.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you to UNESCO and the Institute. We're here to have a friendly debate on assessment issues with several experts in the field. My name is John Sabatini, and I'm at the Institute of Intelligent Systems and Department of Psychology at the University of Memphis in the United States. And with me are Dr. Maria Elena Oliveira, Research Associate Professor, Burroughs Center for Testing at the University of Nebraska, and Dr. Mateus van Davier, Monan Professor in Education in the Lynch School of Education and Human Development at Boston College, and Executive Director of the Tims and Pearls International Study Center. We don't have time to describe the rich biographies and accomplishments of our experts. We hopefully will add that later. I will note that both of them have spent time in their careers working for the Educational Testing Service in Princeton, New Jersey, as have I. So today we're going to talk about testing. Now, teachers and professors routinely develop tests and exams for their classrooms. This is not the prime focus of our discussion debate today. We're here to discuss testing systems developed for use by assessment industry professionals, for use in psychological or educational testing in education, in workplace, or in counseling. So testing systems include not only the test forms themselves, but the tools and software and other supporting architecture. It aid in evaluating the quality and validity of the test score results and reporting them to stakeholders. These are test systems that are expected to abide by standards developed by professional associations such as the American Educational Research Association, American Psychological Association, and the National Center for Measurement and Evaluation, which periodically produce such guidelines as part of accountability and quality control measures and to protect against the misuse of test instruments. The latest edition, I believe this is right, for the test standards for validity and fairness were published in 2014. And some refer to these as standardized tests, which here we can take to mean any test expected to adhere by these industry standards. So our debate question today is, while the standards of test validity and fairness provide a general overview of how to provide for fair and valid test use and to protect against unfair misuse and unintended consequences, we're resolving that they're inadequate to handle new assessment technologies and techniques, such as are emerging with artificial intelligence or AI. Therefore, we need new or additional guidelines and safeguards for the ethical use of tests and test scores. These should be established aligned to specific technologies and techniques. Now, as background for our audience who may not all be experts in testing, it's probably a good idea to provide some plain language explanations of a few technical terms used in the assessment community. You can look up in the standards the precise technical definitions, and our experts can certainly gloss on these as needed. So fairness is mostly self-explanatory. It's that tests and the use of the test scores are not biased against any individual or group. Validity has several key aspects. First, it's that we're measuring what we intend to measure, sometimes called the construct, and not something else. And second, are we measuring reliably? And typically we evaluate reliability with respect to how precise or how stable the test scores are. Meaning if the test is administered over and over, will it produce the same results more or less over time? Another key concept I think it's important in formalized testing is to talk about consequences of test scores. So we often talk about high and low stakes, which refers to how consequential the results are to the users. So a high stakes decision might impact whether you are accepted at a school or college or accredited to practice in a profession. Low stakes might be formative or self-assessment to guide your learning. One other distinction I'd like to make is between intended and unintended consequences. This refers to whether the results of the tests or scores are expected or predicted by design. So in simple terms, is the test measuring what was supposed to measure, and will it lead to or will it lead to unintentional outcomes that were not envisioned as part of the testing tool or instrument? For example, an unintended consequence of a test one subject, we don't teach the other one, so we narrow the curriculum because of what we tested. That should be enough to get us started. If our experts, again, want to, I'd ask them to use plain language when they bring up technical terms, help our audience understand some of these issues as we talk about them. Because this is a debate format, I encourage our experts to disagree with each other without being disagreeable. So you may have shared views on these topics, but we also want to hear, different points of view. So in the end, disagreements may be resolved in discussion. But today we only have about enough time to get the discussions going and introduce some of the complexities. So feel free to kind of mix it up a bit. Okay, so all the questions I'm going to ask, just a few, are going to follow the same format. So should there be new guidelines for the uses of these technologies, and what are they, and what aspects and why? And if you see risks, how do we seek to avoid those? And again, are the current standards, to your knowledge of them, adequate? Okay, so let's get to the first question, unless either of you have an opening comment you'd like to make.
I don't have an opening comment, just thank you for the invitation. This is really exciting. And otherwise, yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Okay.
Same here. Thank you for the invitation. And it's always great to talk to Matthias, even if we need to disagree at this point. But I'm very happy to be participating in this debate. Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll see if you're just as cheery at the end of the debate. Okay, given recent AI advances in evaluating both oral and written speech, live scoring of open-ended responses is now feasible, as well as tailoring follow-ups using AI algorithms based on that score. Should there be limits or guidelines for these kinds of technologies? And please be specific in which ones you're thinking about and what you think might be some risks. Typically in these things, in the American context, we flip a coin. So Maria, I'm going to ask you to pick heads or tails, and that'll determine who gets to comment first.
So yes, absolutely. I do think there should be. So I think there's a lot of benefit for utilizing AI or algorithms for supporting processes that could be automated. But I think there should also be limits. And for instance, combining AI algorithms with human scoring, so it's not all to the machine that's doing all the work. Why? Because I think there could be a lot of introduction of biases in AI, and it's not fully a bulletproof mechanism today. So the limits or the considerations, I think, at this point are more associated with how those training algorithms are created or developed. Are they created with diverse populations? Are they created to be flexible enough to allow different ways of communicating, different accents, different types of grammar, spelling, and other sources of constructive relevant variance that may be flagged as errors without having limits or these types of considerations. And I think that currently the 2012 or 2014 standards, they don't have sufficient considerations, in my opinion, to lay out some of the complexities that have been developed since those standards were developed. I'm part of the steering committee for the technology-based assessment guidelines that International Test Commission and Association for Test Publishers has put together. We just published those in the last couple of months, so I think those are a lot more recent than the 2014 standards. So I would refer us to those for additional considerations.
Matthias?
Yeah, no, that is actually very nice that Maria mentioned that these technology-based testing guidelines. So over the years, there have been a lot of these published in terms of trying to capture what changes when you do even just technology-based testing. And this is one of the examples there. I'm coming more from the world of low-stakes assessments. I think our moderator, John Sabatini, already mentioned that. In low-stakes assessments, these tend to be more systems-level comparisons. They compare countries rather than students. These assessments also have their guidelines. For example, the PIAAC assessment had standards and guidelines, which was one of the first technology-based assessments. But moving a little bit towards AI, there are more recent initiatives. Duolingo just did something about responsible AI standards for assessments that just came out. I'm aware of a few things from the national academies that are also trying to wrap their head around this. They probably won't publish standards anytime soon. There are a lot of activities because not only assessment and education and measurement is trying to understand what AI can do and not. For the more, I think this question was initially probably around a little bit more narrow around automated scoring and not all the capabilities that AI has these days, just as language generation, question answering, question generation, summarization, etc. But just for automated scoring, ETS, as also mentioned by John, has done a lot of work in natural language processing around these. Two ETS authors have a chapter in an upcoming book around natural language processing and assessment. So there's a lot of activities. Unfortunately, we cannot get into detail here because of time constraints, but these researchers try to analyze whether the computer, whether it's AI or more rule-based system, commits errors, makes similar errors or produces similar errors compared to a human rater. The good part is you can then untrain a computer much better than you can untrain a human. A human also comes with prejudices, might also be trained on a very selective sample, but we tend never to talk about that when we talk about AI, at least. So we always say, well, AI has to be limited and has to be somehow, there have to be guidelines. For human scoring, we also have a lot of guidelines, but we know how difficult it is to retrain somebody once they're on the wrong path and they're too lenient or too strict or have certain biases towards certain groups or certain accents or certain types of expressing themselves. That is really hard to find out. For a machine, you can run it over and over again and find out these biases. And there are advanced machine learning algorithms such as reinforcement learning that can then untrain these algorithms and can remove those biases. So I think there's a lot of potential here, but I also fully agree with Maria Elena here that we, of course, would always combine this with a human-based system. So in my own work, I also always have human experts checking both the computer and the human raters in order to improve the training algorithms. So it's never done without the human factor there, and we always use human experts to check what's actually going on.
So I'm going to do one quick follow-up for Maria Elena, and again, maybe speaking to this issue about human bias. Why and how will we be combining humans in here when they potentially create as many biases as the machine, and they're potentially harder to detect when they're doing so? I mean, are they the gold standard?
I guess it depends on the test, the level of standardization. So for example, if we're talking about a very constrained open-ended response, there may be easier to create standards, gold standards. I don't know, it's 0.8 reliability, or there has to be some degree of comparison and commonality between, I don't remember exactly what, is it a 0.8 or 0.9? But I think when you get to assessing other constructs, like collaboration, for example, that's much harder to constrain and to obtain with humans or with algorithms to get a 0.8, 0.9 reliability, because now all of a sudden we're mentioning other constructs like tendencies, social emotional responses, approaches towards carrying out particular tasks. So with knowledge-based assessments, we could get a much higher reliability than other types of tasks, I think.
Oh, that's thank you. That's a real helpful transition there to our next question. So given recent advances in capturing social emotional responses of an individual using the technologies, it's now possible, and many research teams are evaluating emotional responses, and you could use those to adapt the test situation. And separately, but related, we actually can measure socio-emotional learning. And so that's its own sort of construct area. And I don't know the collaboration falls entirely in there, but certainly skills like collaboration, teamwork are among those that the modern testing is very interested in. So should there be limits or guidelines about use of these kinds of technologies in testing environments? And please be specific again, and I'll turn this time first to Matthias.
Yeah, this is a super interesting question. And again, my perspective in this, not only in this debate, also in my work, is much more the low stakes assessments. So there I'm a little bit more sympathetic to these kinds of constructs. When it comes to high stakes assessments, I think I'm very, very careful, if not outright concerned, honestly. And it's in part because of what Maria Elena was saying, in part because of experience I made with, for example, in terms of measuring soft skills, as they are sometimes called, or social emotional learning, whatever you might want to call them, non-cognitive skills, constructs, etc. So there's a whole host of things that kind of are living in the gray area between, is it a skill, is it something you can train, is it cognitive, is it non-cognitive, etc. And these have multiple problems. They are very hard to measure, as we just heard in the previous response. They are soft skills. They are fakeable. That's a huge thing in organizational psychology. So there, for example, you have a lot of discussion around, should you measure these things? Because people can be faking good. They can try to make themselves look good on these skills or not, or skills in parentheses. So I would be very, very careful when it comes to anything around potential applications in high stakes situations. For low stakes, yeah, I can see this, that it might be an interesting area because that does not have a direct influence or direct impact on students. And I can give you an example. So for example, if I was able to measure immediately in the testing situation in an international assessment whether students are engaged and motivated and want to engage in I don't know, even in a group discussion around the topic, and see that they want to do things, you might be able to react and adapt your testing system so that it actually then gives them fun but challenging things to do. Again, only in the sense of you want to gather good, valid information to do systems level comparison. This is not about testing a student, giving a student a score, and then giving them an advantage or a disadvantage. These assessments are only concerned with, okay, how well can students do given an optimal situation? And in order to optimize the situation, to help them understand how this test can be a useful thing to show how well the school, the district, the country can do, I think it is at least worth considering having these testing systems designed such that students are actually willing to engage in that and are willing to act and react in a classroom environment, so that we get good, complete data. Again, because it's not high stakes, we're not essentially checking on them how engaged they are or how collaborative or communicative they are, in order then to give them an advantage at the individual level. So in order to allow to collect better data, I think these kinds of assessments might have a place, but I would be very careful in high stakes environments.
Maria Elena, I know you're very interested in often work in workforce, and employers are very, very interested in the soft skills, non-cognitive skills of their workers. So maybe as you respond to that, you can talk a little bit about, your experience in that area.
Sure. I'm just going to reflect a little bit on Matthias's comments, and then I'll transition to the workplace and say that some of the risks associated with the measurement of social emotional responses or non-cognitive factors, I think, is detecting how, stable factors are non-stable factors, trainable ones, coachable, and the faking. So with that in mind, I think it's important to sort of think about the design of the tasks so that they are designed to capture kind of more durable skills or approaches, rather than something that you want to portray a good day. It's easier to fake in a 15-minute exam or test. The other part, I think, is really important to expand and move forward with research in this area, because as ChatGPT and other mechanisms emerge and grow stronger, knowledge, and we've seen this in the media recently about the MCAT and other tests, where knowledge is sort of answered very quickly through these AI types of mechanisms. It may be the case that we now need to really start thinking about, and this is where I transition into the workplace, is about how do people get together? How amenable are they to work in teams? Are they able to work in teams in transnational corporations, for example? So you're starting to really mix up factors that you cannot assess in knowledge-based assessment. And I think this is part of the reason why the workplace is so interested in these skills, because they're seeing really good grades and utilizing certain accreditation, certain degrees, and thinking, oh, that's starting to lose meaning and signal. Whereas other social and emotional responses or new skills that we're just coming to terms with, like being an influencer, for example. When I was going to school, I never learned that was a really important skill about influencing people, or and I wasn't actually taught that, unfortunately. But there are many skills that are important, that do have signal, that do predict ways in which people will flourish in the workplace or how quickly they'll get promoted, that we're now identifying as relevant, and the extent to which we can develop assessment design systems that incorporate at least those skills with or without the knowledge piece. I think it's important to put that into our conversations. And with regards to whether there should be limits or guidelines, I think there's a very evolving area of research at this point, because some of the guidelines that are out there for the workplace date back to like 70s, right? Like with the uniform guidelines. And so to what extent, technology wasn't as evolved then as it is today. So the uniform guidelines don't actually guide us as to how to consider scores there. And there are technology-based assessment guidelines, for example, but those they're not informing the workplace. You and I were at COABE this past weekend, we were putting together guidelines informed by our 6 teams to think about equity, diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. And I think that's a piece there that it's really important, particularly for the workplace, if we're going to start increasing the use of assessments that require digital skills, because there's a lot of people that are struggling with their digital skills, but yet are in the workplace.
Well, I will note that they did manage to include a brief chapter in the standards on workplace testing and credentials, but I don't think it actually says anything different than any other chapter about it. So I can see how that could be expanded. Very quick follow-up. They're going to hate me for this because we're running long, but quick follow-up to Matthias. So another phrase that beyond influencer that we weren't taught growing up was, or maybe was fake it till you make it. So I'm wondering what you think about the idea that maybe if you can fake it on these assessments, that's actually a precursor predictor that you could be able to have these kinds of skills. You don't have to follow up on that one if you don't think you can.
No, let me just quickly. I was muted. I think research shows that this is not quite the case because it actually dilutes the correlation with then, I don't know, workplace success. So it's recognized that faking it, at least at the level of test scores, does not necessarily predict or actually success there. Again, we're already over time probably, but let me just quickly follow up with these soft skills versus other skills, more the hard type of skills. I don't think they go away, but what sometimes is forgotten, and there are many actually fallacies around that. Usually applicant populations are highly selective. So there might not be signal in skills and hard skills because they're already self-selected, or you already have a lot of steps before you can actually get there. You might need credentials and badges, etc. So we shouldn't completely forget the hard skills, and I think we just need smarter ways to get at them because, yeah, there are these AIs that I've been working on for the past couple of 5 years by now that can generate a lot of text, and that more recently came into the limelight with ChatGPT, etc. So that these models have been around for a while, but now they're really useful and people will use them to cheat. So we just need to get smarter in order to still be able to see whether they understand math or science and whether they can read and write. So we just need different assessments there, but that's maybe another debate.
Yeah, I think they'll have to bring us back for a whole separate debate on just ChatGPT. I've left that one off for now. I'm sure I knew it would come up at some point. 30 minutes in is not bad. Let's move on to the next question, which again pokes at some of these issues. The notion of stealth assessment actually might have been pioneered by another one of our colleagues, Val Shute, when she was at ETS. I remember her introducing these kinds of terms. So stealth assessment is the idea that we can measure outcomes as learning is taking place. So with or without the awareness of the individual, I might add. For example, as a student attempts their learning trials and their instruction, their responses are being recorded and accumulated into a learner ability profile. So from an ethical perspective in particular, should there be limits or guidelines for such technologies and practices? And please be specific again. I think, Malena, you're up first this time.
Great. So I love the notion of stealth assessment. And however, I do think there should be quite a bit of limit and guidelines because they border, invasion of privacy, for example. I think people need to buy into the model, and they should be given the choice as to whether they want to participate in that kind of assessment or not. And there also has to be some degree of transparency as to what's being measured, what's being kept, and be given a choice to to decide whether they do want to certain information to be collected, to be processed, to be analyzed. And there has to be a buy-in from the user that, yes, I'm going to have a machine sort of guide my learning rather than a teacher or an instructor or a peer. So there has to be some degree of laying out of a decision-making path for the user. And although I think there's a lot of benefit as well. So with gamification, the same idea, and also an analysis of errors. So for example, if somebody's answering really quickly, even if they're answering by chance, they're answering correctly, they might be given a lot of more difficult tasks when in fact they were just answering quickly, and because they didn't have the motivation to continue, and without stops and checks, there is no way of noticing that. With regards to guidelines, I think our technology-based assessment guidelines also have chapters on gamified assessments, biometric data collection, and so on. So there's rich information there. And then there's also a development with, I don't know, it's Khan Migo, for example, from Khan Academy, and you've done a lot of work, John, on intelligent tutoring and so on. So in your case, you've had a lot more kind of guided processes rather than purely AI based, I think. And so there are different types of stealth assessment, and I think we should be looking at the various kinds and look at kind of because the guidelines sometimes don't advance or don't get developed as quickly. So to analyze the pros and cons of the various assessment systems that carry out this stealth approach, and what are the benefits and disadvantages of each of those systems, and inform the public of them in very non-technical ways. So that's my quick answer, because I know we're running long. So
it's okay, no rushing. Matthias, benignly, this is processing data. Everybody collects processing data. Every time you go on the web, they learn about you. I mean, what's the problem here?
Good point. Yeah, I was thinking about this. So first of all, stealth assessment is a nice buzzword. So it sounds, of course, very fancy. I think, as you are very right, so process data is maybe the broader term. So you are being monitored by systems you almost expected nowadays when you go on your phone. The phone strangely knows what you've been browsing, and then you get advertisements that fit that browsing history. So we are kind of used to that. Stealth assessment for me is problematic if it, again, is used in a high-stakes environment without knowing that I'm being tested or checked or assessed. If, as Maria Elena was suggesting, if we give people the chance to buy in and to say, yeah, I'm okay with that, then by definition, it's no longer stealth, really. Then I know it's happening. So there are old systems that are more on the learning side, even going back to the 1970s, 80s. I wasn't there, I'm not that old. But there's Plato system, where I think Kumi Tatsuoka and a few others at Xerox were at University of Illinois, I guess. Xerox was involved. There was Alex, which is a system based on the researchers who are behind the knowledge spaces approach. These are all early examples of individualized learning systems. They are very useful because they can help you learn. They can help you by understanding where you are, going from one level to the next, giving you slightly harder exercises, and really help you understand what you know, what you don't know, and where you're lacking. Again, the buzzword today is individualized learning. Another example, what's actually used in the Netherlands, I think one of the countries where you would think they would hopefully treat their children well. They use Math Garden and a few other systems where they do, again, individualized learning, but you have buy-in. It's not stealth. So stealth, I get stomach aches when I hear that. I don't like if you don't tell test takers what you're doing.
Just to
Coming back to
real
the
quick
cell
jump in
phone.
on that.
Yeah.
Just you know, I sign agreements almost every time I use an app that
Yeah.
inform me that basically, you know, I have no idea because frankly I just signed them, but they might say I'm taking your temperature, your blood pressure, so what's the level of is it not stealth if they, you know, measure all, just say we're taking information about you and don't specify? And
Well, they should tell you what they are doing. So they would say, well, we are going to look at what you're doing. Another example is user modeling, which also you probably have to do permission slips for, where you essentially have a software system being adapted based on your level of expertise. So if you know a lot, you get more complex menus. If you know very little and make mistakes and pick the wrong menus, you get a lot of help screens and help bubbles pop up. So there are benign ways to use that in order to help you learn or help you get experience. The malicious ways, I would say, is if they don't tell you and they give you a test score based on something you didn't even know about you were tested on. So I think there I would draw the line, and there I would also draw the line for we need regulations that people need to get informed about if this score, whatever the derivative of whatever the system collects, is used for anything consequential. Going back to one of your 3 criteria there.
In the workplace, if you're utilizing stealth assessment in the workplace and they're measuring, for example, how quickly you push certain boxes around, or and then that's a measure of your productivity, sorry. You know, it gets very interesting because all of a sudden you have a supervision system embedded into your industrial machinery that will tell you how much money you might get, for example, with regards to promotion, or whether you do get to keep your job or not, and many other parameters. And there may be many reasons why you're not being as productive as somebody else. Maybe you're helping another coworker, and then breathing life into those metrics without really understanding, the supervisors understanding how to read those numbers can also get very dicey. So I think it's important to be mindful of those systems, particularly embedded in high stakes situations like the workplace.
I wonder how any of these standard movements could have any influence whatsoever on workplace employers who, you know, may or may not, certainly don't have to abide by any of these things, but I wonder if there's any ways to push towards them caring. Let me move on, and you can continue to comment on that if you think, because this next question pretty much covers everything all at once at the same time. So multi-dimensional dynamic assessment. I'm going to call it a special case of combining all of these elements. And in the special issue, there'll be more than one article, I think, talking about this. So, well, typical tests are sort of, as at least I was taught, to measure one thing at a time in one place at a time, usually. The idea of these multi-dimensional ones is that you might have a situation where multiple domains of learning or skill are being tested or collected simultaneously, with evidence accruing to these different dimensions, and they may take place over a longer period of time, before and after learning. It could be academic achievement, it could be cognitive skills, it could be socio-emotional, it could be these other soft skills we've talked about. So this is sort of the sort of ultimate testing system. So who'd like to start on this one? First of all, do you have examples that you can think of where this is being done somewhat successfully? And I think gaming is definitely one of the areas that this is, and these more virtual environments is where this can come up.
I
Matthias?
think
Oh,
the notion of performance-based assessments and workplace assessments, I think it's trying to get to that situation because we're trying to create some assessment systems where there's some very similitude with the real life, authentic. Because at work, for example, you're required to problem solve and communicate, collaborate in real time with colleagues, or scenario-based tasks. For example, you're such an expert in tries to capture that authenticity, which has a lot of benefits. However, some of the limitations of those approaches, I think, are, particularly with performance-based assessment, the notion of, they have to be informed by a more thorough job analysis, for example, like what are the most salient issues to capture for assessment, how to break, and Matthias is, of course, a world expert in this, but cognitive diagnostic models, for instance, like how do you disentangle the various attributes and the skills, and being able to understand the biases associated with the, measure what our colleague Carl Hegler calls measuring skills in concert, meaning 3 to 4 skills occurring at the same time. And there has to be a very strong matrix, Q matrix, or another approach where you actually design, so that there has to be, the same way that those assessments are complicated, there has to be a very thought through matrix for capturing the skills and understanding, and giving space for differences across cultures with regards to linguistic, cognitive, substantive patterns, so that those are not constrained with tasks that are too narrow, for instance, and you allow people to demonstrate funds of knowledge, the way the various, from a socio-cognitive perspective, how do they solve problems? How do they communicate? How do they collaborate? So at the same time as they're exciting, they are challenging, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, I pick up on the last word, the challenging and the challenges, and I fully agree. So sorry, no debate here. So the thing with these assessments is they have a lot of appeal. They look more natural in the workplace. Of course, work samples are an old example. Then you have these assessment centers, if I remember them right. I've studied psychology a long time ago. More recently, clinical assessments have done similar things. My last appointment before Boston College was the medical board, National Board of Medical Examiners. I should get the name right. They do simulated patients, both computer-based and in real life. They also work with other medical education groups on simulation-based assessment. The Army does that, others do that as well. Simulation-based assessments are a fancy thing that was a work sample in the old world. And I think somebody famous from ETS was once saying, well, if you want to do a test for somebody who is supposed to be on a job assembling a car or assembling a machine gun or assembling hopefully something nicer than a weapon, but say an agricultural device, then maybe the best thing to do is put this person in a situation where they have to assemble something mechanical, such as an agricultural device, not to go anywhere else with that. So maybe our assessments should look more like the activity or the job we are selecting for. This is much harder in the school environment because we don't know yet where people are going. That's why we tend to have more general, maybe somewhat removed tasks or items. So we have a mathematics item or a reading item where we want to look at, do people process language in a general way, because we are not predicting for a specific job. We are predicting out into the future and out across many tasks. For these, not only traditionally, but also in terms of validity and reliability, it is much more straightforward just to check one thing at a time. But I see the appeal of these multidimensional assessments. We just have to be careful also to fully understand the complexities and the limits on agreement with, in terms of across experts, what they mean, agreement about what kind of limits on reliability and validity we have to expect, because we are trying to do everything everywhere all at once.
So what I think I hear you saying, is it fair to say that this is a promising area? It's an area we can and should be working towards, but it's also an area that's not quite as advanced as, say, ChatGPT yet, at least in the minds of those like yourselves who've done a lot of test development and evaluation and validity studies.
I would say it's challenging but interesting. And again, from the modeling, the psychometrics, the statistical area, we would be happy to have more tests like that. So there are a lot of methodologists who also are excited about these approaches. However, they have challenges. And if we don't say these or talk about these both sides, we are really missing out important limitations, but also important advantages.
And to add a little bit there, I think that beyond their complexity, I think it also, with regards to adult learners, for instance, you know, if they haven't actually interacted with computers or human-machine interfaces, or they don't have the same degree of digital skills as others, it could be very challenging, because all of a sudden, to demonstrate knowledge, because all of a sudden you're putting in front of people, you know, a much more complex system with a greater need for digital navigation and buttons that do all kinds of things. And it requires navigational knowledge and it requires digital skills, and it requires knowledge of language. And if you press this button, that happens. And it almost reminds me of VR, where, you know, it gets overwhelming sometimes. And I think understanding accessibility issues with those complex assessments, I think, is very important in order for us to sort of bring everybody forward to the test, to a new testing experience, not just individuals that are really digitally savvy, for instance. So that needs to be accounted for as well, I think, in these more complex systems.
I think that's a very interesting point. I was looking through the existing standards, and they do spend a lot, if not most of their time, talking about the changes in the familiarity with the testing situations that are being brought to them with newer technologies. But it's interesting that, you know, what's familiar is itself a whole avenue here, and whether these newer technologies are becoming familiar or strange to others, and when they become the norm becomes another consideration to take into account if we're going to use the technologies to deliver the assessments. I note in passing that we've all become accustomed to the idea that one might receive a reading test by getting a sheet of paper where one is asked to take and fill in little bubbles, which, as far as I can tell, in the natural occurring world, doesn't exist. It really exists in the universe of testing. And I'm not sure where else you can find an example of doing that, other than it gravitated its way into sort of culture from there, like, you know, Trivial Pursuit and things, where you actually get to do that. So,
we
I
might
think
also have to
technology's
come to
changed.
terms to, sorry, just one more idea here is that we as a psychometric society or group, we might have to come to terms with certain parameters that we might have to leave behind. So like the comparability between paper-based assessments and computer-based assessments. At some point in time, we've been doing a lot of research to say whether the new experience is comparable to the paper, but the more we move towards these complex digital skills, I think certain paradigms that we hold dear in our psychometric world, we'll have to sort of be saying goodbye to.
I agree.
Very
I
well
wouldn't
put.
call it psychometric directly. I think it's more familiarity, as you said. It's much more that people simply expect things to look a certain way, and they have somewhat limited ideas in terms of how things get to be translated in a computer-based environment. The problem there is much more that the construct really changes in the sense of once you add digital aspects, it's still reading, but it's reading in the 21st century. It's not like reading goes away. These are still words. They are still little, mainly very often black lines on white background, but maybe reversed on the computer. And we somehow decipher them into what we call words. And we build sentences out of these, or try to build sentences out of these little things. So that thing doesn't change, but the context, the way we can manipulate them, the way in which they are presented to us, and how we can choose between different sources, that changes a lot. So these things change. The psychometric models don't necessarily change. They can adjust to, well, you're measuring something slightly different, or you might have additional components. I think it's more the issue of the, maybe educating people that once you have a new technology, and as John said, those bubbles were, now we consider them natural, but they really have never been natural or naturally occurring anywhere. So.
Well, I want to thank you. I'll give you one last chance to add a final comment after I say thank you to both of you. I think, I hope our audience feels that, if there's a lot of thoughtful consideration going on, I hope these new standards gravitate towards APA and others so that they become widely known. And I expect we'll be able to give citations to them in the transcript of this so that the individuals can look them up. And I think there's a lot of potential in the future, but I do think there's a lot of risk, and I think it's great to know that everybody's thinking carefully, at least on the test production and use side, about how these may interact and impact on society and cultures. So thank you. Does anybody have any last words they want to tuck in?
Just a big thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for moderating this debate. It's been great to exchange these ideas as we move forward with the future of testing.
Thank you. Thank you so much.